The Queen Mother became a symbol of British resolve because she wouldn't leave the king or send her children away during the Blitz. But the same public legacy also contains a rigid campaign against Wallis Simpson, a major overdraft, and 2 living nieces listed as dead in Burke's Peerage. The question isn't whether every dark story is true. It's what the record can actually prove. In September 1940, Buckingham Palace was hit during the Blitz, while King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were in residence. Windows shattered. Rooms were damaged. Princess Elizabeth was 14. Princess Margaret was 10. The idea of sending both girls overseas, possibly to Canada, had been actively considered. Queen Elizabeth rejected it. Later accounts attribute a clean, memorable chain of reasoning to her. The children wouldn't go without her, she wouldn't leave the king, and the king wouldn't leave Britain. A longer variant preserves the same logic. The children won't leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does, and the king won't leave the country in any circumstances. The exact polished wording of either version can't be traced to a contemporary wartime transcript. Both remain retrospective formulations of a well-documented decision. The princesses stayed in Britain. They didn't remain at Buckingham Palace through every raid. They spent much of the war at Windsor Castle. That distinction matters because the truth is strong enough without embellishment. Elizabeth and George chose to stay in a country under attack, appeared at bomb sites across Britain, visited troops, hospitals, factories, and damaged neighborhoods, and made themselves visible in a capital being struck from the air. A remark associated with the palace bombing became part of the Queen Mother's legend. In varying forms, she said that being bombed meant she could look the East End in the face. The sentiment appears to have come from a private letter to Queen Mary, written on the day of the bombing, rather than from a press conference or public speech. The East End visits were real. Crowds were initially hostile in some cases, throwing rubbish and jeering at a woman in expensive clothes while their homes burned. And the Queen's designer, Norman Hartnell, eventually dressed her in gentle pastels and florals to project, in his own phrase, the rainbow of hope. The palace bombing and the remark, wherever it originated, became the story that resolved the early hostility. The royals had been hit too. The family that asked ordinary Londoners to endure had been inside a building when bombs fell on it. This was the foundation of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's public standing. Her popularity wasn't invented after the fact by nostalgic documentaries and royal portraits. When she died at Royal Lodge, Windsor, on 30 March 2002, aged 101, contemporary coverage called her Britain's beloved Queen Mum and a symbol of courage. Roughly 200,000 people filed past her coffin during 3 days of lying in state at Westminster Hall. Some waited up to 12 hours. Estimates for the crowd along the funeral route on 9 April ran to about 1 million. British television viewership for the funeral was reported at roughly 10 million. Queen Elizabeth II, in the royal household statement issued 8 days after her mother's death, described the outpouring of affection which has accompanied her death. No historical poll can prove she was the single most beloved royal of the 20th century, but the evidence for genuinely extraordinary public feeling is quantifiable enough. Queues extending for miles, hours of waiting, millions watching, and the public statement from a reigning monarch. The affection existed, and it endured. That matters for what comes next, because the reassessment is only worth making if the starting point was real. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon entered the royal family in 1923 when she married Prince Albert, Duke of York, the second son of George V and Queen Mary. She had refused him twice before agreeing. She had worried, as she put it, about never again being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she ought. George V's mother eventually visited Glamis to see the woman who had captured Bertie's attention, and came away convinced that Elizabeth was the one girl who could make Bertie happy. Their wedding took place at Westminster Abbey on 26 April 1923. Elizabeth made a small gesture that the press noticed. She laid her bridal bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior, in memory of her brother Fergus, killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915. The gesture was unplanned, according to some accounts, but it became famous precisely because it connected royal ceremony to the sacrifice families in the public had also made. She wasn't expected to become queen. Her husband became George VI only because his older brother, Edward VIII, abdicated on 11 December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. Albert reluctantly took the throne. Elizabeth became queen consort. Their coronation took place on 12 May 1937, the date that had been scheduled for Edward's coronation, with Elizabeth's crown set with the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The new king had a stammer, an intense dislike of public exposure, and no expectation that the crown would fall to him. Elizabeth became the steady public partner beside him. Her cheerful demeanor helped earn her an early nickname, the Smiling Duchess, and during the war her hats, pearls, pastel frocks, and constant engagements helped create a recognizable figure of national reassurance. After George VI's death on 6 February 1952, she became Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, then gradually the monarchy's national grandmother. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who met her on the 1939 Canadian and American tour, described her as perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing, and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. That last clause is worth holding. Even an admiring contemporary could see the performance inside the warmth. She was also very good at the public side of royalty. That phrase isn't an accusation. It's a description of a job that required photographs, ceremonies, controlled access, press coverage, and carefully repeated symbols. Her image rested on a consistent visual language across 5 decades. Bright clothing, broad hats, flowers, horses, military patronages, hospital visits, church services, long public engagements, and an unmistakable manner that suggested continuity with an older Britain, even as Britain changed rapidly around her. Over half a century, those rituals made her familiar. Familiarity turned into emotional attachment, and emotional attachment turned into public mythology. That mythology wasn't manufactured from nothing, but it had considerable help. The archive was shaped. William Shawcross, who wrote the official biography with access to personal papers, letters, and diaries, produced an account drawn from material curated before historians saw it. Reporting around the official biography also noted that Princess Margaret ordered the destruction in 1993 of sackfuls of private papers, including letters from Diana, Princess of Wales. We can't know everything that was destroyed or why. We can know that the public memory of the Queen Mother emerged from records that had been selected and filtered before they became available to researchers. A carefully presented image does not prove the person inside it was false. It does prove that the image had professional help and survived partly because inconvenient material didn't. That distinction becomes important when a sharp phrase enters the story. In June 2000, The Observer and Guardian journalist Vanessa Thorpe reported on a 50-year-old box of correspondence and legal papers concerning Marion Crawford, the former governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. Thorpe wrote that the material produced a portrait of the Queen Mother as ruthless and unforgiving. The article concerned Crawford's long exile from royal favor. Crawford had helped produce a magazine account of the princess's childhood for an American publication, and the Queen Mother reportedly never forgave her. Thorpe further reported that documents suggested Elizabeth had secretly participated in a plan to sell childhood stories to an American magazine, while Crawford later bore the public blame. That characterization belongs in a specific category. Ruthless and unforgiving was Thorpe's interpretive framing, not a phrase Elizabeth used about herself, not a court finding, and not a scholarly consensus. The full Crawford papers weren't reproduced in publicly available material for independent examination. The episode matters not because it definitively proves a character verdict, but because it reveals the terrain beneath the warm public persona. Royal privacy was treated as an institutional asset. Breaches were handled with institutional severity. Elizabeth reportedly said years later that it is always a mistake to talk about your marriage. The principle extended well beyond marriage. The principle was control what becomes known. That instinct shaped the longest and bitterest conflict of her life. The familiar version of the Wallis Simpson story is compact. Wallis, an American divorcee, took Edward VIII from the throne. George VI and his wife inherited a crown neither had wanted. Elizabeth resented Wallis for the rest of her life, referring to her privately as that woman. The basic outline is true. The mechanism that made it institutional rather than merely personal is more complicated. On 11 December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated. Albert became King George VI. 3 months later, on 8 March 1937, George VI issued letters patent conferring the title of Duke of Windsor on his brother. Edward remained a royal highness. On 27 May 1937, a second set of letters patent drew a formal boundary. George VI provided that Edward could hold the style of royal highness personally, but his wife and descendants, if any, shall not hold said title, style, or attribute. 7 days before the Duke and Duchess married at the Château de Condé in France on 3 June 1937, the legal line had been drawn. No member of the British royal family attended the wedding. Wallis became Duchess of Windsor. Her official style was Her Grace, the Duchess of Windsor, not Her Royal Highness. Without HRH, she wasn't legally entitled to the formal courtesies given to a royal highness. People weren't required to curtsy to her as they would to a member of the royal family. Her ceremonial place in the hierarchy sat below the rank Edward had always wanted for her. George VI issued the letters patent. Government lawyers confirmed that the sovereign could regulate royal styles through the royal prerogative. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's cabinet discussed the draft on 26 May 1937. Dominion governments were consulted and supported the exclusion. Queen Mary, Edward and George's mother, shared the view that Wallis shouldn't receive the full royal title. So did Queen Elizabeth. The documented decision belongs to George VI, his government, and the Crown's constitutional machinery. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had no power to issue letters patent. She didn't legally create the 1937 exclusion by herself. That framing matters because the stronger, more defensible case against her isn't that she invented the policy, but that she worked to maintain it with exceptional tenacity over the following 4 decades. Elizabeth had watched her husband become king because Edward chose a twice-divorced American woman over the throne. George VI inherited the crown in the middle of a constitutional crisis, with the monarchy's public standing damaged and a stammer that made every public speech an ordeal. His wife inherited the role of queen consort at a moment when the institution itself felt fragile. Their daughters' lives changed completely. Princess Elizabeth, then 10 years old, became heir presumptive to the throne. The abdication cost this family something real. Biographical accounts consistently describe the Queen Mother as carrying that cost forward in her attitude toward Wallis. She reportedly called Wallis that woman, a phrase that appears in multiple secondary accounts across decades, though the original private correspondence hasn't been publicly reproduced in full. The hostility didn't fade with time or diplomacy. It became something closer to policy. One reported episode illustrates how personal feeling translated into official conduct. During the Duke of Windsor's wartime posting as Governor of the Bahamas, A documentary-based account states that Queen Elizabeth instructed officials not to bow to Wallis or address her as Your Royal Highness. The underlying instruction hasn't been published as a verified primary document. It remains a reported protocol episode rather than a proven royal command. But the pattern it describes is consistent with everything else the record shows. An active effort to ensure the legal exclusion was also enforced in social and ceremonial practice. The Windsors remained distant from the main royal family for decades. They were excluded from many major royal occasions. The 1937 wedding was unattended by the family. Senior royals didn't publicly receive Wallis as an equal. Edward spent years lobbying for some official role in Britain and never received one. The couple shuttled between France and the United States, largely excluded from the ceremonial world Edward had inhabited as Prince of Wales. Historian Piers Brendan characterized Elizabeth's attitude as a vendetta in a documentary account and attributed the severity of the HRH exclusion largely to her anger over what the abdication had done to George VI. That is Brendan's interpretation, not a fact about Elizabeth's inner life, and it overreaches by suggesting a one-woman authorship that the constitutional record does not support. What the record does support is narrower and more durable. Elizabeth was among the most determined supporters of a hard family and institutional posture toward Wallis, and she backed that posture for the rest of her life. The story sometimes tries to turn this conflict into a medical explanation for George VI's death. Some popular accounts imply that the stress of the abdication, the conflict with Wallis, or Elizabeth's sustained hostility somehow killed him. The medical record does not support that. George VI was a heavy smoker. He had arteriosclerosis and Buerger's disease. In September 1951, surgeons at Buckingham Palace performed a left total pneumonectomy, removal of the entire left lung, for carcinoma. He appeared to recover. On the 6th of February 1952, he died in his sleep at Sandringham, aged 56. The official cause recorded was coronary thrombosis against a background of severe smoking-related disease. There is no supplied medical or documentary evidence that Wallis Simpson, the abdication crisis, royal family stress, or Elizabeth's attitude was the proximate medical cause of his death. The conflict with Wallis is historically significant because of power, precedence, and exclusion. It does not need invented medical causation to remain serious. After George VI died, the widow he left behind became the Queen Mother at 51. Her daughter, Elizabeth II, was 25. A different kind of pressure then emerged. Queen Elizabeth. The Queen Mother maintained two significant residences, Clarence House in London and Royal Lodge at Windsor. She sustained substantial households with staff, engaged in ceremonial public life, maintained racehorses, entertained extensively, and supported a social world built over 5 decades of royal life. She continued active public engagements until just a few months before her death at 101, 7 weeks after the death of Princess Margaret. From the outside, she projected the image of a woman whose habits were old-fashioned and whose pleasures were those of a simpler Britain: horses, gardens, church, family, old friends, and familiar places. The financial reality was more complicated. Her civil list annuity was reported at £643,000 a year. Household and lifestyle estimates in press and biographical accounts ran to between £1 million and £2 million annually. That gap does not describe a woman spending recklessly on luxuries invisible to everyone else. It describes the structural economics of a certain kind of royal life, in which the costs of maintaining the visible public image, staff, residences, entertaining, horses, travel, are themselves enormous and expected, and in which the funding available through official channels does not cover them. A person can own substantial assets and still run a chronic deficit. The Queen Mother's financial problem wasn't insolvency in the ordinary sense. It was a sustained mismatch between annual expenditure and annual income, bridged by banking arrangements and family support, rather than by any reduction in lifestyle. Coutts, the private bank associated with the royal family, became the institution most publicly associated with the imbalance. The most frequently reported figure was a £4 million overdraft. A 1996 report connected to the preparation of the official biography cited a £4 million overdraft at Coutts, despite the £643,000 civil list annuity, attributing it to inevitable financial shortfalls. After her death, The Guardian reported a joke attributed to Elizabeth II. Coutts would have folded long ago but for Mummy's overdraft. It's a memorable line. It's also an anecdote, not an authenticated transcript. Its appeal lies in the wry candor it implies, a reigning monarch acknowledging privately what was also acknowledged in the press. Whether Elizabeth II said it in exactly those words remains uncertain. The exact total is contested. No public bank statements have confirmed the final Coutts balance at 30 March 2002. No published probate inventory separates every debt, asset, trust, and payment with precision. Later commentary sometimes puts the overdraft at a peak of £7 million. That larger figure isn't supported by publicly available banking documents and shouldn't be stated as established fact. It circulates in narrative reconstructions rather than in primary financial records. What the defensible record shows is this. The Queen Mother carried a reported multi-million-pound overdraft at Coutts over years. Her regular income didn't meet the cost of her establishments and lifestyle, and Elizabeth II reportedly subsidized her mother during her lifetime and cleared the overdraft after her death using private or inherited resources. The Financial Times, in reporting on the Queen Mother's financial history, summarized the arrangement in careful language. The Queen subsidized her mother and was reported to have paid off the overdraft at Coutts after her death. The conditional phrasing, was reported to have, reflects the private nature of the transaction. The broad pattern is well reported. The precise mechanics stay hidden. The financial picture has one more layer. In 1994, reporting stated that the Queen Mother placed approximately £19 million, described as roughly two-thirds of her accessible money, into trusts for great-grandchildren. That transfer, if accurate, would have significantly reduced the assets available for her personal debts, while also sheltering wealth for the next generation. Assets held in trust aren't automatically available to cover a personal overdraft. The Queen Mother could, in principle, be structurally cash poor in the years before her death, while remaining the nominal beneficiary of a larger family financial picture. At death, press estimates placed her estate between roughly £50 million and £70 million. Some earlier estimates were lower. Much of the value lay in art, jewelry, Fabergé objects, racehorses, household contents, and other privately held assets that are difficult to convert quickly into cash. Her will, which left her entire estate, described mainly as the contents of her houses, to Elizabeth II, was sealed. The public couldn't independently verify the precise asset and liability schedules. Under a 1993 arrangement between the government and the royal household, transfers from a former sovereign's consort to the reigning sovereign were exempt from standard inheritance tax. The estate passed to Elizabeth II without inheritance tax liability. That arrangement isn't unusual within the structure of royal wealth. It's, however, an arrangement not available to ordinary citizens, a point that quietly frames the entire financial story. The tension in the financial section isn't a single dramatic number. It's the gap between a public image and a private structure. The Queen Mother was beloved partly because she seemed to represent a stable, unassuming, old-fashioned Britain that endured. The lifestyle behind that image was sustained by an overdraft at a private bank, by subsidies from the reigning monarch's private funds, by a sealed will, and by inheritance tax arrangements that kept royal wealth circulating within the family. The public saw a hat, a smile, and a race meeting. Behind those appearances were banking arrangements, household expenses, and a family capable of absorbing costs that would overwhelm almost any other person in Britain. That is the Costlier financial legacy, not a proven bombshell figure, a documented pattern of sustained deficit, private support, and structural financial dependence that coexisted for years with a public persona of reassuring modesty. The final section of this audit is harder in a different way. It has less certainty around the Queen Mother herself and more certainty around two women who couldn't speak for themselves in any public record. Nerissa Jane Irene Bowes-Lyon was born on 18 February 1919. Her younger sister, Catherine Juliette Bowes-Lyon, was born on 4th July 1926. They were born in London, daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon and his wife Fenella, who was the daughter of the 21st Baron Clinton. John Herbert Bowes-Lyon was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's brother. Nerissa and Catherine were therefore the Queen Mother's nieces and first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret. Fenella became responsible for 4 children. Nerissa and Catherine had severe intellectual disabilities. The clinical and institutional terminology used during their lifetimes described them in language now widely recognized as degrading. Modern accounts describe them as having profound learning disabilities and record that neither learned to speak. Their lives shouldn't be narrated through the administrative labels applied to them by a system that treated people with disabilities as social problems to be managed. In June 1941, Nerissa was 22. Catherine was 14, close to her 15th birthday. Both entered Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, Surrey. Royal Earlswood had roots in the 19th century institutional system, established during the period when Britain was constructing a nationwide network of segregated facilities for people with intellectual disabilities. On the same day Nerissa and Catherine entered Earlswood, 3 related Fane cousins, daughters of Harriet Hepburn Stewart Forbes Trefusis, sister of Fenella, also entered the institution. Their names were Idenia, Etheldreda, and Rosemary. 5 women from connected aristocratic families entered the same institution on the same day. That detail is often overlooked, but it matters for the historical context. Institutionalization in mid-20th century Britain was widespread. The 1913 Mental Deficiency Act had established a formal legal framework for classifying and confining people with intellectual disabilities. Families across the social spectrum, including aristocratic families, placed disabled relatives in long-stay institutions when community provision barely existed. The practice wasn't unique to royalty. It wasn't invented by the Bowes-Lyons. Professor Jan Walmsley, writing on the history of institutionalization, cautions against imagining the past as a simple march from darkness into light, against assuming that earlier generations were simply more evil than we are, and that later generations improved on simple moral enlightenment. The forces at work included fear, paternalism, eugenics ideology, a genuine lack of community support, and the family pressure that came from caring for people whose needs were blindly what households could reliably provide. Contextualizing institutionalization as historically widespread does not excuse what happened to Nerissa and Catherine. It separates 2 questions that must be kept separate: why disabled people were institutionalized in 1940s Britain, and why 2 institutionalized women were recorded as dead in a public peerage register while they were alive. Nerissa remained at Royal Earlswood for approximately 45 years. She died there on 22 January 1986, aged 66. Only hospital staff attended her funeral. She was buried at Redstone Cemetery near Earlswood. Her grave was initially marked with a plastic tag and a serial number, not a named headstone. Later, after her existence became public, the family arranged for a gravestone to be placed. Catherine remained at Royal Earlswood until the hospital closed in 1997. She was then transferred to a care home in Surrey. She died on 23 February 2014, aged 87. She had lived 73 years in institutional care. The central document in this story isn't a rumor or a family secret. It's a printed page in a published peerage reference book. The 1963 edition of Burke's Peerage listed Nerissa as having died in 1940 and Catherine as having died in 1961. Both women were alive at Royal Earlswood when those entries were printed. Nerissa, according to the 1963 Burke's listing, had been dead for 23 years. In reality, she was living in Royal Earlswood, and would continue to live there for another 23 years before her death in 1986. Catherine, listed as having died in 1961, was actually alive in the same institution and would remain alive until 2014, 51 more years after Burke's recorded her death. A peerage entry isn't a hospital admission record. It does not automatically reveal whether every family member knew what it said. Burke's publications relied on information supplied by families, not on independent verification. The publication printed what it was given. What it was given was wrong about 2 living people. The discrepancy became public in 1987, after Nerissa's death the previous year, when press reporting, including coverage in the Los Angeles Times and in Britain The Sun, revealed that the Queen's cousins had been institutionalized and had been listed as dead in Burke's while living. The Los Angeles Times reported that Burke's had received faulty information. Burke's editor, Harold Brooks Baker, reportedly responded that if the Bowes-Lyon family had provided the information, it wasn't normal to doubt the word of such a family. Later reporting attributes the false death information specifically to Fenella Bowes-Lyon. She was the sisters' mother, their surviving parent, and their legal guardian after John Bowes-Lyon's death in 1930. The family later disputed the characterization of the Burke submission as deliberate concealment, with Lord Clinton suggesting in 1987 that his Aunt Fenella was a vague person who had incorrectly completed the Burke's form. That explanation sits uneasily with the specificity of the false entries. Burke's peerage printed specific years of death: 1940 for Nerissa, 1961 for Catherine. Not blank spaces or vague absences. Specific dates require specific information. The original Burke submission form hasn't been publicly reproduced. The most accurate formulation the available evidence supports is, Burke's peerage said it relied on family-supplied information, and later reporting attributes the false death dates to Fenella Bowes-Lyon. Now, the hardest boundary in this story. The available evidence does not establish that Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, ordered the sisters' institutionalization in 1941. Their surviving parent and guardian was Fenella. The decision about institutional care belonged to her. It does not establish that the Queen Mother submitted the false Burke dates or instructed anyone else to do so. It does not establish that she visited them, refused to visit them, funded their care, or withheld funding. It does not establish with documentary precision when she first learned they were alive. Some later accounts state that the Queen Mother discovered her nieces were alive in 1982 and subsequently sent gifts and money for their birthdays and Christmases. A family member, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, Fenella's granddaughter, said the Queen Mother sent money for toys and sweets after learning they were alive, and disputed the characterization of family abandonment shown in a 2011 Channel 4 documentary. No published hospital record, letter, diary entry, or official document in the available research substantiates the 1982 date precisely. It appears in secondary reconstructions, but not in cited primary sources. The 2011 Channel 4 documentary, The Queen's Hidden Cousins, interviewed nurses and staff who said that, to their knowledge, no member of the Bowes-Lyon or royal family had visited Nerissa and Catherine during their time at the hospital, and that no birthday or Christmas gifts or cards had been sent. Family members disputed this. Lady Elizabeth Shakerley called the documentary cruel and intrusive, and said other family members had visited over the years and sent gifts and cards. The Guardian's reviewer, John Crace, noted after the broadcast that the documentary had not answered the one genuinely still mysterious question. Why were the sisters placed in care in 1941 and then listed as dead? Those competing accounts can't be cleanly resolved from the evidence available. Documentary testimony from nurses isn't the same as official records. Family members' recollections of visits and gifts aren't independently verifiable. The disagreement itself shows why this case remains painful rather than settled. One additional detail belongs to the documented record. When Nerissa died in January 1986, her funeral was attended only by hospital staff. None of her family was present. She was buried at Redstone Cemetery, near Royal Earlswood, with a plastic tag and serial number marking her grave. Later, after the media exposure in 1987, the family arranged a headstone. 3 of Fenella's grandchildren, Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, Patrick Anson, the 5th Earl of Lichfield, and Catherine Somerville, organized the gravestone. The Queen Mother was also, for much of this period, a patron of MenCap, the charity supporting people with learning disabilities. That fact does not prove personal wrongdoing. It sharpens the distance between the public role and the family history. The moral problem in this case does not dissolve because personal attribution is unresolved. Nerissa and Catherine entered Royal Earlswood in June 1941. They were listed as dead in Burke's Peerage in 1963, while both remained alive. Nerissa died in 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. Those facts are documented and don't depend on any particular claim about the Queen Mother's knowledge or instructions. The cruelty of recording living people as dead isn't softened by noting that institutionalization was common. The two questions stay separate. Why disabled people were confined in mid-20th century Britain, and why 2 confined women were then removed from the living family record. Think about what that entry in Burke's actually did. It didn't simply omit them. It didn't leave their entries blank. It assigned them death years, 1940, 1961, that made them appear to have died before they entered Royal Earlswood or shortly afterward. For anyone using the 1963 edition of Burke's to understand the Bowes-Lyon family, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon didn't exist among the living. They had been sorted out of the family record. This is why the case became part of the public conversation about the royal family when it emerged in 1987, and why it returned when The Crown included an episode addressing it in 2020. The series creator Peter Morgan acknowledged that the dramatization contained inaccuracies and invented dialogue. But the underlying facts, the 1941 admissions, the false Burke's entries, the decades of institutional residence, are documented and don't require dramatic license to be disturbing. The Queen Mother's legacy has attracted many rumors beyond these documented facts. Allegations of alcoholism, private cruelty, prejudice, and involvement in later royal tragedies. Most of those claims lack adequate documentary support or depend on repetition through popular culture rather than evidence. They aren't repeated here because they would weaken rather than strengthen the account. Rumor isn't the same as record. An argument that reaches for unsupported allegations has already admitted that the supported ones are insufficient. The supported ones are sufficient. There is a documented system of image management around a genuinely popular woman who was very skilled at being a public figure. There is a dated set of letters patent signed by George VI on 27 May 1937 that formally denied Wallis Simpson the HRH style through a government-backed constitutional mechanism. And there is a sustained, decades-long history of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon supporting and maintaining the hard line that instrument established. There is a reported multi-million-pound overdraft at Coutts, annual costs that consistently exceeded her civil list income, and a private financial rescue whose precise mechanics remain sealed from public view. There are 2 nieces admitted to Royal Earlswood in June 1941, then listed as dead in the 1963 Burke's Peerage, while both remained alive, in the same institution, for decades afterward. Each of those claims belongs in its proper evidence category, and the script has tried to keep them there throughout. The refusal to send the princesses to Canada is a documented decision, even if its famous quotation has no secure wartime transcript. The Buckingham Palace bombing is a documented event, even if the exact East End remark varies from retelling to retelling. The HRH exclusion is a documented formal decision, enacted through George VI letters patent after cabinet discussion and Dominion consultation. Elizabeth's personal hostility toward Wallis is supported by multiple biographical accounts across decades, but specific protocol episodes remain reported characterizations rather than publicly available primary records. The £4 million Coutts overdraft is a contested total, widely reported, not confirmed by public bank statements. The £7 million figure is less secure still and shouldn't be stated as a verified fact. Nerissa and Catherine's June 1941 admissions to Royal Earlswood, their decades of institutional residence, their deaths in 1986 and 2014, and the false Burke's Peerage entries in 1963 are documented. Fenella Bowes-Lyon's responsibility for supplying the false information is reported through accounts of family-supplied material to Burke's, though the original submission hasn't been publicly released. The Queen Mother's direct knowledge, instructions, or involvement isn't established by the available evidence. These distinctions aren't evasions. They are the difference between holding the record accountable and holding a person accountable for actions the record can't prove she took. Both kinds of accountability matter, and conflating them would make this account less trustworthy rather than more damning. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's courage during the Blitz remains historically real. She stood beside a reluctant, stuttering king whose accession began in constitutional crisis and whose later health was seriously affected by smoking-related disease. She remained in a country under active aerial bombardment. She helped turn the monarchy into a visible symbol of shared endurance at precisely the moment when that symbolism might have collapsed had the royal family fled abroad. Millions mourned her in 2002 because the attachment was genuine and had been earned over more than 6 decades. But public affection does not revise the institutional record. It does not revise the coldness of a posture toward Wallis Simpson that lasted from 1937 until Elizabeth's death in 2002. 65 years of sustained opposition to a woman whose legal exclusion was formalized before she was even married. It does not revise years of spending that exceeded her own income, covered by private arrangements and a sealed estate that the public could never fully audit. It does not revise the 1963 Burke's Peerage, the specific false years it printed, or the women who lived for decades after those years, while their recorded lives had already ended. The familiar image survives. It survives because the wartime courage was real, the service was long and visible, and the public attachment was earned rather than manufactured. It does not survive untouched. On the 1963 Burke's Peerage page, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon is recorded as having died in 1940. Catherine Bowes-Lyon is recorded as having died in 1961. Nerissa was alive at Royal Earlswood when that entry was printed and remained alive until 22nd of January 1986. Catherine was alive at Royal Earlswood when that entry was printed and remained alive until 23rd February 2014. 2 living women, recorded as dead. Decades to go.